Thank you all for coming on Monday morning. This is a GraSPP Reserch Seminar series, as well as one of the social science security studies unit forum. We hold such seminars as well as forums open to the public, inviting notable speakers from around the world. And today's speaker is Dr. Alexander Lanoszka. Down here, he's the assistant professor of international relations at the University of Waterloo. Professor Lanoszka has been a frequent visitor to our campus, and as he has been working on nuclear issues with an historical perspective, conducted fieldwork research, as well as attended a large number of meetings that was held here. So you can immediately see that, well, there are small group, really. You know each other. And our discussant today is Dr. Wakana Mukai, who is not only a friend of Alex. You've been working on virtually the same topic all the way, right? So Dr. Wakana has also been working on history of nuclear development from a historical perspective. If anything, Dr. Wakana's focus was on the Japanese case of nuclear development programs in 1960s, and with a particular focus on the Doyama Commission. So I think we'll have a great discussion today. The first question, as you can see in the abstract, goes like, do alliances curb efforts by states to develop nuclear weapons? And if you have more questions about this topic, you have to read this book. This is Alex's work, Atomic Assurance, the Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation. And I can't think of a more timely issue to discuss this morning, for the simple reason being that the alliance as related to nuclear weapons seems to be crumbling down in the East Asian region, and that is between Korea and the United States, as well as between US and Japan. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Alex to discuss this great issue.
Terrific. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. This session has much personal significance for me because indeed, 6.5 years ago, I spent 5 weeks not living too far from here, doing field work, conducting interviews, including some of you in the audience, in developing this project for what was at the time my dissertation at Princeton University, but is now obviously a complete book. So thank you so much for coming here on a Monday morning at 10:30 a.m. no less, to hear me talk about issues relating to alliance politics and nuclear proliferation. So as Fujiwara sensei had mentioned, my talk today is going to be focused primarily on the substance of my book, as well as implications of that book for understanding current events. The book is on sale for a hefty price on Amazon.com, if I dare say, but you can get it for free on cornellopen.org. It's legal, so you don't have to feel too bad about downloading the book for free. It's available in various formats too. This is probably the most superfluous slide I could possibly create. It's needless to say that alliance politics has reemerged as fairly central to international politics in general in the last 10 or so years. So specifically since 2008 with the Russo-Georgian War, as well as China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Seas. There have been a lot of questions about whether the United States would really come to support its treaty allies in South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, to say nothing of commitments in Europe. In the event of a militarized crisis or even, God forbid, war. And certainly, we've been seeing a lot of mixed messaging from the White House as to whether the United States will really come to the aid of any beleaguered allies. This is not simply true of the Trump administration, although we can all agree that these concerns have intensified since 2017. But certainly, when I was here in 2013, I remember having many conversations about whether the Obama administration would really defend Japan against Chinese aggression, or South Korea would be defended against North Korea in light of some of the messaging seen from the Obama White House. So there has been much concern, simply put, over America's reliability as a security guarantor. And as such, there's been a lot of punditry as well as commentary to the effect that nuclear proliferation risks are on the rise. So we have seen in Europe notions of a German nuclear bomb being discussed in various policy circles. We see commentaries to the effect that South Korea's interest in nuclear weapons might be reignited. We seem to be, if the popular press is to be believed, on the precipice of some new nuclear cascade. In parallel to these developments in the policy sphere, there has been an emerging scholarly consensus as regards to alliance politics and nuclear proliferation. To begin with, some scholars like historian Francis Gavin have argued that nuclear non-proliferation has been as central to American grand strategy or US foreign policy as containment and economic openness have been since 1945, that this has been a long-standing pillar in how the United States tries to manage its security relationships abroad, intent, as it were, to make sure that nuclear weapons do not spread, so that the United States can control escalatory dynamics, to project military power over its allies and potential adversaries, as well as to resolve local security dilemmas that might ensue. And so, because the United States has been very preoccupied with nuclear non-proliferation, has been also very effective, so the conventional wisdom goes, in curbing nuclear proliferation among treaty allies. So we see scholarship by the likes of not only Francis Gavin, but also Jean Gurjoy, Nick Miller, Mark Trachtenberg, argue that the United States has used various tools of statecraft to ensure that its treaty allies sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if not ratify it, or make other sorts of commitments against the spread of nuclear weapons. But because the United States is much weaker than what was the case in the 60s and the 70s, when it was going about suppressing the nuclear-related behavior of its treaty allies, the United States is going to have a tougher time in cementing the nuclear non-proliferation regime. It does not have the same sort of economic wherewithal as it did in the 1970s. It's still a major power, obviously. It's still number one in the world, but certainly not to the same extent as in the 1990s, to say nothing of the 1980s. And so, if the United States has less wherewithal in using tools of statecraft to suppress the nuclear proliferation ambitions of its allies, then it follows that the United States will be much less effective in the future than in the past. So once again, we should expect to see an increase in nuclear proliferation. So the scholarly consensus and even the punditry have all more or less converged on this notion that nuclear proliferation is probably going to happen. And it's certainly more likely than ever before, especially in the current environment. My book, however, makes a slightly different argument. To me, nuclear proliferation is far more contingent, and that we should not necessarily believe that alliance politics has been the key driving force in ensuring non-proliferation outcomes. What I argue is twofold, more specifically. Firstly, that countries evaluate their received security commitments from the United States with reference to not only the foreign policy doctrine of the United States, so whether foreign policy interests overlap between the ally and the United States, but also, and more importantly, I would say, the conventional military deployments that go into shaping alliance credibility. It really matters for the United States to have military forces either on the territory of the ally or in the theater of operations where the ally might be fighting its adversary. And if we look at these two variables, so to speak, we actually see a lot more continuity over time in ways that should actually give us some optimism for the future, and I'll explain why later. The second argument that my book makes is that alliance coercion has not been as effective for nonproliferation as commonly assumed, certainly with respect to the emergent scholarly consensus that we have seen in the literature. When countries have decided not to acquire nuclear weapons, they usually do so for their own reasons that might be independent of their relationship with the United States. So that is basically the argument of the book in a nutshell. But rather than walk you through the mechanics of the book, the research design, the case selection, the cases themselves, I figure it would be more important or more interesting, rather, to discuss 5 core insights that I hope will flesh out these two strands of my main argument. So the first core insight is that it is easier to prevent an ally from initiating a nuclear program than to stop an ally that has already started one. So there are 2 parts to this I want to convey here. The first is that this observation is much consistent with standard notions in the literature on coercion in international politics, that is easier to deter than to compel, because with compellence, it tends to be much more provocative. You have to force someone to refrain from doing something that they are doing, or to stop activities full stop. And when countries begin a nuclear weapons program, that ultimately means mobilizing state resources and having their bureaucracies start working towards these sorts of goals. It's very difficult to get those bureaucracies to stop once they get going. Now, this point raises an important question. What do we mean by countries that have initiated a nuclear program? So here I need to explain exactly what I am studying in this book. So there are standard notions of nuclear proliferation that exists in the mainstream international relations literature. And they typically involve the usual suspects of countries that span most regions of the world. These are measures that are often included in data sets that are analyzed in quantitative works on nuclear proliferation. But what I argue in the book is that there are certain methodological issues that come with this standard definitions or codings of nuclear proliferation cases. So my favorite example is that of Indonesia. Indonesia is interesting because the reason why we code Indonesia as being a nuclear proliferator is because President Sukarno had said at an event one time in the 1960s or 1970s, I forget when exactly, that he was interested in getting nuclear weapons. That is it. That's the only reason why we consider Indonesia to be a nuclear proliferator. It's just on the basis of that speech. Whereas really, in the other context of Libya, we know that there was a bona fide nuclear weapons program. We know in India, China, the United States, and so forth, that they've actually acquired nuclear weapons. There seems to be a lot going on here that I would say there's no systematic approach to understanding why these countries are labeled as nuclear proliferators. So I really talk about those countries' interest in procuring enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. And here, as a matter of fact, we actually see a lot more variation, or more countries rather, that have actually gone about these activities, including Japan, as a matter of fact. Japan never had a leader like Sukarno who said, I'm interested in getting nuclear weapons. But it did things operationally that if you did not know any better, you would think Japan might, in fact, be a nuclear proliferator. The same is true of countries like West Germany in the 1960s and the 1970s. Didn't say flat out it was going to get nuclear weapons, but it did things under their radar that, if you did not know of any better, seemed to be consistent with getting nuclear weapons. So what I try to do in the book is examine what gets these countries started on this sort of path. Why do they embark on this path? Arguing, of course, that it's easier for the United States to deter them from getting on this path. But once they're on this path, it's really hard to reverse themselves or get them to renounce these sorts of activities. So the second argument pertains to what really makes up the fabric of alliance credibility. So in the international relations literature, we commonly believe that just having an alliance written down is sufficient for credibility. I don't need to tell this room how problematic this view may be in 2019. There's a lot more that needs to happen before we can start feeling very confident about the received commitments a country has. Having a treaty alliance is nice, but interests can change. You don't really know whether the alliance treaty can really be believable in various circumstances or war scenarios. Foreign policy doctrines are a very useful metric to identify whether your interests or your willingness to fight an adversary are in line with that of the United States. But because interests can change, you want to look at more hard measures as to whether the alliance commitment you receive really has any sort of backbone or any sort of teeth. And so I argue that ultimately what really, really matters is not actually what is being said on social media or in presidential speeches, but rather what the United States is putting on the ground for the ally. That in-theater military forces are crucial for making American nuclear guarantees believable. Note here, I don't necessarily mean nuclear military forces. Like those scholars like Terence Rehring have also argued, conventional military deployments are also fundamental because for two reasons. Firstly, troops on the ground help give skin in the game. They signal that the United States is willing to put its own military personnel, as well as their families, in the danger zone, so to speak. But this is good for deterrence by punishment, which is to say that if the United States were to be attacked on the territory of its ally, it might be tempted to go full nuclear at the outset in some devastating riposte. What I argue is that we value American military personnel on allies' territory, not because they're going to die, and that would trigger some sort of response, but because they're going to kill. So American military forces being combat credible in a way that can fight an adversary at least to a stalemate, if not to an actual victory, is ultimately what lends an alliance commitment credible. The third core insight of the book is that the American coercion of allies who started or were tempted to start a nuclear weapons program has played less of a role in forestalling nuclear proliferation than analysts have assumed. This picture depicts John F. Kennedy next to Willy Brandt and Konrad Adenauer, the latter two being chancellors of West Germany, Adenauer being the predecessor to Willy Brandt. And this is obviously taken in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. West Germany has become an interesting case study for many scholars of nuclear proliferation and alliance politics, because scholars like Mark Trachtenberg and Jean Gerjoy have all alleged that West Germany put itself on the path towards nuclear weapons development starting in the mid to late 1950s, but decided against going nuclear because of American pressure. According to Mark Trachtenberg, for example, the United States pressured Adenauer to resign because Adenauer looked like he was getting nuclear weapons. Adenauer then withdrew from consideration from elections in 1962. And even so, a couple years later, the United States issued some more threats telling the West German government not to acquire nuclear weapons. Apparently that message got relayed, and ergo, the West German government decided to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1969. That sounds compelling until you start digging into the details, and you realize that the reason why Konrad Adenauer did not stand for election in 1962 is because he was 85 at the time and had been mired in a major crisis, had nothing to do with nuclear weapons whatsoever. That in fact, after Adenauer had left the scene, questions over West German intentions on nuclear weapons continued. There may have been some back and forth between West German and American diplomats, but as other scholars from Germany who argue, it's not entirely clear whether the threat to abandon NATO or West Germany were conveyed to Bonn, the capital of West Germany. But more to the point, if West Germany had started to embark on nuclear weapons proliferation because of concerns of American troop withdrawal in the 1950s, as I argue in the book, then why would telling the West Germans point blank that they would be abandoned be useful for ensuring that they're not going to get nuclear weapons? There's a paradox here. Why would you threaten abandonment when abandonment fears are what inspire the ally to seek nuclear weapons in the first place? It does not compute whatsoever. So nuclear proliferation, as it happens, is driven by other circumstances. We don't want to give the United States too much credit here, as some of my colleagues in the United States have. Indeed, it's interesting that my German colleagues tell a very different story about what happened with West Germany than my American colleagues, which should tell you something about how American-centric some of these studies can get. The other thing to note is how variable America's interest in nuclear proliferation or non-proliferation has been. So I've stated at the outset of my presentation that there are scholars like Francis Gavin who argue that nuclear non-proliferation has been a consistent pillar in American foreign policy and grand strategy. Dislikes nuclear proliferation because it upsets local power balances, disrupts security dilemmas, or creates security dilemmas, as well as makes it harder for the United States to project power over its allies. It seems intuitive, but again, if we revisit the historical record and look at it more closely, then we find that there's much more complexity to the case, that the United States actually waxes and wanes in its interest in nuclear non-proliferation. What really has to happen is for there to be complementary foreign policy goals for nuclear non-proliferation to be something that has pride of place in American counter-proliferation efforts. So let me give you an empirical example to this effect. South Korea started its nuclear weapons program shortly after Nixon, President Richard Nixon, decided to withdraw unilaterally 20,000 forces from the US Army 7th Division on the Korean Peninsula. Thereafter, he began the nuclear weapons program. Now, it would seem that the United States, once it discovered this program, did so because it wanted to control escalation, all those things that I mentioned. Right? At the same time, Taiwan flirted with nuclear weapons, with a nuclear weapons program starting in the 60s and the 70s. And the United States similarly tried to turn the screws on that treaty partner to ensure that it would not go nuclear. Right? So it seems like the United States is intent in both cases not to let those allies get nuclear weapons. Right? This seems consistent so far with the Frank Gavin story. However, at the same time, we have to keep in mind what the United States is doing in the region more generally, and that is, of course, rapprochement with China. The concern that the United States had with these treaty allies is that those allies would sabotage American-led efforts to pursue diplomatic rapprochement and later normalization with those countries. You cannot go about in a good faith manner rapprochement with China when you let your allies get nuclear weapons. It does not work, not necessarily. Certainly not with Taiwan. And indeed, what I argue is that because there was a convergence of various foreign policy goals at stake here. That is why the nuclear non-proliferation, became so important for the United States to resolve. In some cases, the United States actually might want its ally to tiptoe towards nuclear weapons because it might lend credibility to the overall deterrence relationship with the adversary. To be sure, the Nixon administration played the so-called Japan card in the 1970s, saying Japan might get nuclear, therefore strike a deal with us. But in general, if you're pursuing rapprochement, you want to restrain your ally. Now, not all is hopeless, of course. What I argue is that to the extent that U.S. counterproliferation is effective, the United States can use its economic and technological reliance or leverage over an ally to ensure that the ally's nuclear bid does not succeed. So in the case of South Korea, the South Korean government was very much reliant on foreign suppliers of various sensitive nuclear technologies. The United States basically told those potential suppliers in Canada and France and in Belgium not to supply. South Korean government had a lot of difficulty in getting nuclear weapons. So this is an effective avenue for ensuring some sort of counterproliferation outcome. Now this might be harder because the nuclear markets become much more diverse and much more multipolar, but this is still one potential avenue where U.S. counter-coercion can work. So in summary, with respect to the main cases, I find that, yes, alliance politics does seem to matter, at least in terms of triggering the nuclear interests of allies. But when we look at other explanations I did not really elaborate, but those that focus specifically on the adversary, on domestic politics, or on prestige, whether a country values nuclear weapons for their own right, we actually find a much mixed bag. That other factors seem to be shaping the allies' interests in starting and in stopping nuclear proliferation. So what does this all mean for the current environment? Obviously, a lot of unhelpful American first rhetoric. I don't need to tell you that here in Tokyo in November 2019. That being all said, what's particularly interesting to me is that despite all the rhetoric, and I get it, it's awful. It's horrible. It's not good for alliance management whatsoever. I don't mean to dismiss all of that. The ambience is very bad. Notwithstanding all of that, there's still been much operational continuity in U.S. military operations. In fact, in the case of Germany, the United States has actually added forces to Germany, let alone strengthening the NATO presence in Central Eastern Europe with rotational forces in Poland, for example. Even in the case of South Korea, the U.S. forces remain largely in place. Now, again, I'm a little nervous about making this point in light of recent news, but I take the view that Trump's bark is far worse than his bite, and any change that's going to happen will likely be modest, precisely because the United States has other values and goals at stake here rather than how much a certain ally pays. But we have been seeing this particular continuities in place. And as such, there is a silver lining here. Like, the United States still retains a very credible deterrent posture vis-a-vis adversaries like Russia and China. But the other thing that makes me a little more optimistic, or less pessimistic rather, if you think nuclear proliferation is bound to happen, is that nuclear power is actually in the retreat. I don't need to tell you this in this country, but even in the case of Germany, Germany's nuclear capabilities are much less than what was the case in the 1980s, even. So, and in South Korea too, under the current leadership, there's a greater willingness to embrace natural gas rather than nuclear. So, things are contingent. Anything could happen, as I like to say these days, especially these days. Anything could happen. But I'm sort of one who looks at the past in the last 50 years of nuclear proliferation and find that these sorts of things have happened in the 60s and the 70s. We're not quite there yet. We could be there, but we've also learned from those experiences, And the international environment still remains much different, and I would argue even better in some respects. I don't want to go back to the 1960s.
Thank you, Alex. Like you pointed out, with Germany, Japan, South Korea did not become nuclear powers.
No.
And one argument would be that alliance politics may have played a major role in preventing West Germany, Japan, or South Korea to develop into nuclear powers. That may not be so. And Alex's argument about the impact of alliance politics is far more nuanced than the simple argument that alliance politics prevented those U.S. allies from going nuclear. We don't really have a straightforward answer on this. And as it turns out, Wakana, Dr. Mukai, has been working on virtually the same question in her dissertation, so I can't think of a better person to give biting comments.
Scathing comments.
Oh gosh.
Dr. Mukai, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you, Alex, for providing an in-depth outline of your book. Explaining and generalizing a country's decision on certain nuclear activities and nuclear policy is extremely difficult. And there are various factors and there are various time frames. So congratulations on this beautiful book. And I think that Alex was really wise enough to voice out this extremely difficult work by, I would say, beautifully illustrating the facts that we are not able to actually explain these things just by a single digit or single factor and generalized theories. Multiple factors do account to a certain outcome, and it is important to acknowledge interaction among these factors. And I think that what you did in your book was to kind of examine how these factors interrelate with each other. But the core was the alliance factor. So several questions and comments, I guess, regarding the book. So if alliance mechanism, as you said in your book, is not enough to prevent proliferation, then what can you say would be a key external factor that would shape a country's attitude towards nuclear policies? And this is kind of a really hard question, but because people are talking about alliance mechanisms all the time, but you are saying that that's not the key factor. So what would be the key factor should people in the policy industry ask you?
Right.
The second one is about the time period that you actually selected for each case studies. The time period differs from a little bit from case to case. So in the case of West Germany, it's from 1954 to 1970. In the case of Japan, it's from 1952 to 1980. South Korea, it's from 1968 to 1980. So you didn't really give out why you chose this time period in your explanation earlier on. So it would be nice for us to kind of know why that time frame was important for your study. The third point, going a little bit into the Japanese case, one of the biggest and most unique characteristics of Japan is no doubt the experience of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you touch upon this part a bit in the chapter, the Japanese chapter, but you don't go really into that factor, telling the audience that that's one of the key factors that kind of shape the decision-making process in Japan. And I fully agree with you on that point, but discarding all the points about this emotional part that the Japanese society experienced is somewhat too much. I mean, I'm not saying that you're doing that. A lot of scholars go either pointing out too much on that emotional side or not pointing out to the emotional side too much. So I was wondering if you were to put a little bit of that piece in your Japanese package, where would you frame that emotional part in your analysis? Let's see. And then as a Japanese, and maybe it's only me, but I'm always puzzled by the wording of nuclear capability, because it has a dual kind of meaning. On the one hand, we have the civilian nuclear capability, and then on the other hand, we have the military nuclear capability. So is it fair enough to say that building high-spec civilian nuclear technology, as in the case of Japan, for example, relates to the development of the intention towards nuclear weapons? So it's a little bit different from my perspective, but I want to know about what you think about that case. And the case of Japan, we have the enrichment program and we have the reprocessing technologies, and that has always invited huge debate within the non-proliferation community. And it is really hard actually to figure out the true intention behind that technology, and that's what you have been illustrating in your book as well. So there is always a question mark behind all this civilian versus military, and I fully agree with you on that point. When I talk with people engaged in the nuclear industry, especially scientists and engineers, they always, well, they don't clearly refer to, but they kind of refer to the if problem. So if the circumstances change, Japan would have the ability to possibly build nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So virtual deterrence, hedging cars are thought to be important for Japan. Would you say that that's sort of a prestige for the scientists and the engineers? We often look into how decision-making community has acted or not acted on certain policies. But for nuclear-related technology and policies, I think that voices from the industry side, so the engineers, scientists, have quite a bit of influence, and we cannot ignore that fact. So the what-if scenario is very attractive, not only for scientists and engineers, but also for statesmen as well. And unfortunately, statesmen do not have a clear understanding of the what-if problem, and they tend to kind of blur out these things accordingly. And so in order to maintain a strong budget in the nuclear industry, I think that sometimes engineers and scientists kind of put in these kinds of image into the statement mind. And so do you see that kind of same thing going on in other cases that you touched upon? So I only know about the Japanese case, but for example, the West Germany case, South Korean case, what kind of role did the scientists and engineers have? And then one last question, sorry, I'm going on a bit too much. On cases that you have not selected, personally, I am interested and want to hear a little bit about the case of India and Pakistan. They were both seeking, in different ways, security assurances from the United States and sometimes from the Soviet Union, but they were not fortunate enough to get those security assurances. And then they moved on to gaining their own nuclear weapons. So if you were to put those two cases into your theory, what would you have, what kind of solution or thoughts can be provided? I have more, but I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Alex.
All right. Is this on? Okay. Thank you so much, Makan, for carefully reading the book. That's, for me, the number one honor. It's not so much when people buy your books, when they read it. As a matter of fact. No, seriously, it's really flattering because it means that you devote, not money, but time, right? Especially, as well as energy for identifying really smart, insightful comments as what you have done. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So if alliances are not enough to prevent nuclear proliferation, then what is the key external factor? Or could I step back and just ask, what is the key factor then? Because if it's not the alliance, then it's probably the adversary, right? And if it's the adversary, then I think that is a bit mixed. Now, to be sure, states sometimes look at the adversary through the lens of the alliance. So it's really hard to disentangle perceptions of the security commitment from perceptions of the adversary. If the adversary is very strong and the security commitment is weak, then the weakness of the security commitment is only in relation to how strong the adversary is, right? So there's also that issue. But sometimes we can identify cases where, as in West Germany, the adversary was seen as relatively weak, the Soviet Union, or unwilling to engage in actual hostilities vis-a-vis the West. But they felt that the alliance was under sufficient duress that the Soviet Union could put itself in a position. So in that case, the alliance actually has causal primacy rather than the adversarial threat. So the factor I would say is particularly important is actually leaders' beliefs. Ultimately, it comes down to how leaders are thinking about nuclear weapons. And in the case of Park Chung-hee, for instance, that was a leader who some would label like an oppositional nationalist, see the world in very adversarial terms, accord much importance to South Korean sovereignty above and beyond what might be normal, and so would see nuclear weapons more or less as prestige objects. Right? There could maybe be an argument for a South Korean nuclear weapons capability, but I was never convinced of its military usefulness given the geography and the military balance. And so I've come to the conclusion that Park Chung-hee never really thought carefully what he would actually do with nuclear weapons once he was able to develop them. I'm not aware of any document that outlines some prospective nuclear doctrine. And based on my conversations, no one seems to know what Park Chung-hee thought, which sort of tells me that his thinking was very cloudy, but he knew that nuclear weapons were a good thing because they were associated with industrial progress and scientific advancement at the time. So that's good news then for arms control activists and disarmament proponents, because if you can influence beliefs, then presumably this can actually shape decision-making, maybe not in the near term, but over the long term. So I would argue that leaders' beliefs ultimately is what is really important. The time period depends on various factors, not least because I wanted there to be sufficient variation within the cases themselves, right? So obviously Japan was not contemplating nuclear weapons acquisition seriously at all in the 50s, let alone the early 60s. But there were conversations about whether nuclear weapons would violate the Japanese constitution. After all, that was a time when the United States security guarantee was especially strong. So I wanted to look at that case and see how individual leaders were talking about nuclear weapons or the alliance, and just to use that as a foil for what would come later. And certainly in the case of South Korea, I could have probably ended it a few years after 1980, as a matter of fact, because even in the early 1980s, South Korea was undertaking questionable nuclear activities that didn't really come to light until much later, but nevertheless were seen as proliferation risky. But with respect to the emotional side to nuclear non-proliferation, I remember having this conversation, maybe with you and Fujiwara Sensei back at the time when I was working on it. But my understanding was that Hiroshima played less of had less of an influence than we typically believe. But what was really important was, in fact, the Daigo Fukuru Maru incident, which I had to look up. That's why I had to be through the book, because I didn't want to mistakenly call that incident something else. And that was when Japanese trawler fishermen were exposed to radiation fallout following the detonation of a nuclear device that went over beyond scientific expectations in the Bikini Atoll. I think that was much more salient in the Japanese political imagination. Not least because I think there was some censorship too that curbed speech on Hiroshima. And so the political memory was actually not as well developed as you might think, whereas the Daiogo Maru incident was much more developed because it happened after the occupation, after all. Classic question about intentions. I have no good answer. I have really no good answer as to whether acquiring centrifuge capabilities in 1969, or making that a priority at least, as in the Japan case, really signifies some sort of intent. I'm very hesitant because I don't want to stray too far from what the data say. That being said, I do believe that the what-if problem is real. I do believe that the timing of acquiring these capabilities, cannot necessarily be entirely coincidental. Note the date, 1969. Right? 68, 69, we see a flurry of statements as well as articles written by various Japanese decision makers or leading experts about the deteriorating quality of the Japanese security guarantee in light of American failures in Vietnam and the domestic turmoil that was starting to characterize the American body politic. So as much as I'm very hesitant to say that the Japanese government had this clear intent to acquire nuclear weapons, I don't think that's actually what happened. I think their posture was much more of hedging, and they sought to acquire these technologies precisely because of the what-if problem that you identify. And such, I'm skeptical of arguments that take as given that the nuclear capabilities that Japan does have, at least the latent nuclear capabilities, are some sort of deus ex machina, that they come out of nowhere. I think I'd be surprised if they really, if Japan stumbled upon this virtual capability by accident, like Britain acquired its empire by an absence of mind. I'm a little hesitant to go that far too. But what's interesting is that even in the late 1960s, even in Japan, there were notions of prestige being wrapped with conversations about nuclear weapons, precisely because it saw that Great Britain and France were going to be recognized as nuclear weapon states in the late 1960s, and the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that was just being negotiated at the time. And Japan, being the upstart economy that it was, saw that it could be a second-class citizen in international politics by not having access to these weapons. And certainly, if they were comparing themselves to Great Britain, which at the time was not doing well at all economically. In fact, it was really struggling. Then Japan was like, well, if those guys can have this status, why can't we? But of course, there are other ways of getting status in international politics besides getting nuclear weapons. But I think in the case of South Korea, again, this is where prestige consideration matter. And even in conversations that I had in 2013, so it's still maybe now a long time ago, the scientific community did use the specter of the what-if question, I think quite cynically, in order to extract more resources and attention from the South Korean state. So there are some who argue, like Jock Hyman's, that scientists have this epistemic aversion to nuclear weapons. I don't think that's entirely accurate. India, Pakistan, I think there's a story there, but I'm not a South Asian expert, if I'm being honest. I'm going to stay within my lane. But from what I understand, that Pakistan did lose its alliance with the United States when the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, CETO, had come to an end. But I'm really reluctant to speak off the cuff about cases I don't really quite understand. But I imagine that that their relationship with the United States, uneven as it was, probably mattered to some extent.